Welcome to the 80s with Jamie. That's me. Today we're going to talk about 1988. And to start, let's talk about some events. Specifically, let's start to the end of some pretty bad conflicts. So in 1988, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, which they invaded in 1979. They signed the Geneva Accords in April, which were the results of talks between the USSR, US, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So the Soviet troops began to leave with a full withdrawal the following year, ending a 10-year invasion. And in 1988, if you said that the US would have a war in Afghanistan in the future for twice as long, ending in our own humiliating withdrawal, I wouldn't have believed you, but it happened. Then after 8 years and 1.5 million dead, the Iran-Iraq war ended. If you told me in 1988 that the US would have not one, but 2 wars with Iraq in the future, I would not have believed you then either, but it also happened. So let's talk about some space events. The US resumed space shuttle missions with the launch of the Discovery 2.5 years after the Challenger disaster. And the USSR launched the Soyuz TM-5 mission, taking 3 cosmonauts to the Mir space station. So the Cold War and the space race was still on in 1988. Another interesting event to me is that archaeologists uncovered the original Globe Theatre in London. This is a famous theater where the plays of William Shakespeare were performed after 1599. That's pretty cool, right? So let's switch gears and talk about technology. The first computer worm to be distributed over the internet, written by Robert Tappan Morris, launched from MIT and crashed 10% of the world's internet connected computers in just one day. But nobody really gave a shit though, because nobody really knew about the internet in 1988. And this is why nobody also did not give a shit that the Netherlands became the second country to connect to the internet in November 1988. So Jarkko Oikkanen in Finland created the first internet-based chat protocol. And guess what? No one really gave a shit because it was 1988. 2 things people might have given a shit about are the first laptop called a notebook came to the market. It was released in October by NEC called the Ultralight. So for about $5,088, you too could be like Captain Picard. And Thomas Knoll created the first version of Photoshop. So let's talk a little bit about food and beverage history. So 1988 was a big year for like beer especially like microbrews and craft beer. So Deschutes Brewery was founded in 1988 in Bend, Oregon by Gary Fish. And if you're a native Oregonian like me, you know about Deschutes Brewery. In college, my friends and I were particularly fond of Black Butte Porter and Mirror Pond Pale Ale. And now Deschutes is the 8th largest craft brew and the 15th largest overall brewery in the United States, producing 15,000 barrels a year. Gordon Birch Brewing Company is a German-style brewery that was founded in Palo Alto, and now you might see their beer in Costco and Trader Joe's. And then Great Lakes Brewing Company was founded in Cleveland, making it the first brew pub and microbrewery in the state of Ohio. And then North Coast Brewery Company was founded in Fort Bragg, California. And Powers Brewery, now called the Tatalia Brewery, was founded in southwest Queensland, Australia. And they make 4X, which is what you should order, or a Victoria Bitter in Australia. So try to go to Australia and order a Foster's, and they'll probably tell you to order a 4X. Santa Fe Brewing Company, now the largest brewery in New Mexico. Sinclair Breweries Limited, the parent company of Orkney Brewery and one of Scotland's first microbreweries. Sleeland Breweries, founded by John Warren in Ontario. It's now the 3rd largest brewing company in Canada, and it's owned by the Japanese, so that's why you see imported on the Sapporo beer in the US. You might think it's from Japan, but it's actually from Canada, but they can slap imported on it. That's right. Cheating. Then Wen Brewing Company was founded in Wen, Shropshire, England. I totally didn't say that right. Williams Brothers Brewing Company was founded in Scotland, and China got Pabst Blue Ribbon, which they call Lan Dai Pijiu, which means blue ribbon beer. So there's a good translation. Let's talk about movies now. Let's talk specifically about action movies because action movies were still in full force in 1988. So let's talk about one of the best action movies of all time, Die Hard. It stars Bruce Willis and actually had kind of low commercial expectations, which it defied. It grossed like $141 million on a $28 million budget, and it really set a trend with kind of the lone everyman against a colorful terrorist in an isolating setting. So it was very influential. And I checked out a little trivia, and I didn't know this, but this was Alan Rickman's first like film role as the bad guy Hans Gruber. And you'd think that he was starring in films for decades, but he wasn't. But he was already established as a theater actor, so he was no amateur. And spoiler alert here, his famous fall scene off the Nakatomi Plaza was a surprise. So Rickman dropped from a 70-foot high platform into an airbag, but they dropped him early, so that look of terror is real. And the famous one-liner, "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker," was improvised by Bruce Willis. It's one of the best one-liners in action movie history, and it was ad-libbed. We have a fun podcast episode all about action movie one-liners. By the way, it's the official stance of the 80s and 90s.com and then 80s and 90s Uncensored that Die Hard is not a Christmas movie because it was released in July, and you don't release Christmas movies in July. So argue with us if you want, but that's our official stance. Now let's talk about Rambo 3. It's interesting in hindsight because the film was all about Rambo helping rebels in Afghanistan fight Russians. I wonder if the Russians ever made a movie like that's about maybe a Russian Rambovsky or something helping Afghan rebels fight Americans in the 2000s and 2010s. I don't think they made a movie like that, but it seems like a missed propaganda opportunity. Anywho, Rambo 3 was the most expensive film made at the time, with a budget of like $63 million. And at the time, it held the Guinness Book of World Records for violence, with 221 acts of violence, 70 explosions, and 100 characters killed. And yes, there was a Rambo toy line in the 80s, because it was the 80s. So a few more action movies that come to mind are Braddock, Missing in Action 3 with Chuck Norris, Action Jackson, which was meant to launch Carl Weathers' action career, but he never really took off in the same way other action stars did. Shoot to Kill with Sidney Poitier and Tom Berenger. I didn't know about this movie, but it's kind of like capitalizing on the buddy cop craze. And then another buddy cop movie, Dead Heat. It's like an buddy action cop zombie film with Treat Williams and Joe Piscopo. Shakedown, an action crime thriller with Peter Weller and Sam Elliott, which I've never seen and never heard of, so we'll have to do an overlooked film review on that. Red Heat, another kind of buddy cop action comedy with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jim Belushi. Midnight Run, which is another action comedy with Robert De Niro and Charles Gordon. I don't think I remember this. I'll have to rewatch this. Then The Rescue. I never saw this. It's about a group of teens who infiltrate a North Korean prison to save their Navy SEAL fathers. I just added this to our overlooked watch list. And then Young Guns was an awesome action western, and I think this revived the western genre, which you'd see a lot of after this movie came out. And then Alien Nation. This is like an alien buddy cop action film, which I really like. And then there were two martial arts action films that debuted in 1988. And the first one is Bloodsport, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, about Frank Dukes, a special ops guy who runs away to Hong Kong to compete in a martial arts competition to save the honor of his master. It's a good one. And then Above the Law, starring Steven Seagal, about Nico, an ex-CIA agent and Aikido expert turned Chicago cop investigating a criminal conspiracy and kicking ass along the way. So these movies launched their respective stars' careers, but they would kind of their careers would kind of diverge after a while. And we have a fun podcast episode all about Jean-Claude Van Damme versus Steven Seagal. And it's it's a really fun one. It's one of our most fun ones to record. So please check that one out. Let's talk about more movies. So Tom Cruise was busy with the number one film of the year, Rain Man. And this film was critically praised and won a bunch of awards, and well deserved too. It's a great movie. But he also starred in the ninth highest grossing film called Cocktail, which was critically panned. A lot of critics didn't like it, but it still made money, and I kind of like it, so it's one of those movies I'll defend. Let's talk about comedies. Again, comedies were much bigger in the 80s than today. On the top 10 highest grossing list, you had Coming to America, awesome film with Eddie Murphy, Big with Tom Hanks, Twins with Arnold and Danny DeVito. It's so good. Crocodile Dundee 2, The Naked Gun, and Beetlejuice, which we have a whole podcast about because we love it so much. You should check it out. And then the second highest grossing film was Who Framed Roger Rabbit? This is a great film you just don't hear about these days. It combines live action characters with both Disney and Warner Brothers cartoons, and maybe that's why you don't hear about it. I guess you can stream it on Disney Plus now, but for such a huge film, it's kind of went under the radar, and I don't know, I'd like to hear your thoughts about why that is. Let's talk about television. So The Wonder Years debuted on January 31st. This was a great show, coming of age show about a kid growing up in the 60s. It premiered the night after the Super Bowl, and the girl next door character, Winnie, was played by Denisha McKellar, who grew up to be a total hottie, and do you know she writes math books for girls? That's pretty cool, right? And think about this, if this show debuted today, it would be a coming of age show about a kid who was growing up in 2004. I graduated college in 2004 after 4 years of military service, so old. Other debuts were 48 Hours, which I still think it's on today. America's Most Wanted premiered on Fox, which ran until 2011, and it helped capture over 1,200 fugitives. And then the Vietnam War drama China Beach also premiered. And this show premiered Roseanne. So this was kind of a more realistic sitcom, family sitcom about kind of a working class family. And I could really relate to it. Roseanne really reminds me of my mom. And it dealt with issues like financial struggles and employment and healthcare and trying to get by. And I like the idealized family sitcoms because I wanted them to be my family. But as far as like families that were more like mine, Roseanne definitely hit the mark. And then Yo MTV Raps debuted on MTV. Bringing hip hop from the underground to the mainstream. So let's get into music and specifically rap and hip hop. So 1988 was kind of the year when rap and hip hop became part of the pop culture in a mainstream way. So for our music section, let's talk about some of the rap artists that I kind of remember. NWA's Straight Outta Compton hit shelves on August 8th and was a huge West Coast hip hop album. He had Dr. Dre producing it and had Ice Cube, which kind of propelled him as a top-tier rapper. It also had Eazy-E and was kind of a Cali gangsta rap album. And you still see the album cover as kind of a meme today. There's some shirts here in Issaquah, and it's got the same kind of album cover as MWA, but it says Straight Outta Issy. Yeah, Issaquah is not Compton, by the way, which is why it's funny. Public Enemy, so It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. Very socially engaging and politically charged rap and lyrics. Slick Rick, very creative with kind of an English bent and some humor. Big Daddy Kane became kind of a hip hop and rap sex symbol. And then DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. He's the DJ, had a more mild, kind of family-friendly vibe, but loads of fun and making it commercially successful. And we all know about the Fresh Prince, Will Smith, and what he did, but I was interested about DJ Jazzy Jeff. I wish he wouldn't have made his name that because it's hard to say, but he stayed in music and runs a Philly production company called Touch of Jazz. And I guess he was hit hard with COVID, really hard, but fortunately he recovered and he spent a lot of time raising awareness about, taking precautions. So Eric B. and Rakim launched Follow the Leader. Ice-T released Power, which was pretty aggressive, but a lot of social commentary and kind of propelled Ice-T. And then Run DMC, so they released Tougher Than Leather, and they still had kind of that blend of rap and rock. And then Kid and Play, remember Kid and Play? Remember their like pencil eraser haircuts? They released Too Hype in 1988, which is that's a lot more humor and fun than a lot of the gangster rap albums that came out. So yeah, 1988 was probably the first year where rap and hip hop became mainstream and part of the mainstream culture, and as far as I know, it's been that way ever since. So let's talk about books. A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking was published, and it explored big questions like how the universe began and what made it start possible. Is time truly linear? Is the universe, unending, or is there boundaries? If there are boundaries, what's beyond? It's pretty big stuff. So this all heavy stuff, but his book brought these big scientific questions and ideas to the masses. And I've always admired Stephen Hawking and how he could share just a piece of his fantastic brain with us, despite his disabilities. I've always respected Stephen Hawking. I think he's awesome. And a few books turned movies, so Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris and Dead Poet Society by H. Clenbon. And then in the world of comics, you had a couple big Batman series come out. Batman Year One by Frank Miller with art by David Mazzucchelli. And this was dark and it had a lot of influence on like Christopher Nolan's trilogy, especially his first one, because it's kind of a Batman origin story. And then Batman the Killing Joke by Alan Moore. This is art by Brian Bolland, and this was a pretty dark one. It's kind of a Joker origin story, and it includes kind of this assault on Barbara Gordon to like make the commissioner like mess him up, and they made a animated rated R animated film about it. It's pretty good, but it's pretty dark stuff. So you started to see in the 80s like a lot of dark comics coming out that I think still have a lot of influence on like superhero genre today. And then let's talk about sports. So the 1988 Olympics were held in Seoul, South Korea, and like for the first time, the U.S. and the Soviet Union weren't boycotting anything, so they competed this time. So this was the first Olympics held in South Korea, making it a significant moment in South Korea's history. And the opening ceremony featured a spectacular showcase of Korean culture, including like traditional music and dance. And because it was a Korean thing, Taekwondo made its Olympic sport debut, which as far as I know, is still around today. South Korea did well, earning 12 golds, 10 silvers, and 11 bronzes, many of which were in Taekwondo. But one of the biggest scandals in Olympics history, Canadian Ben Johnson set a world record of 9.79 seconds on the 100-meter race, but was later stripped of all his medals for doping. See, doping wasn't just the Russian thing. And then Carl Lewis won 4 gold medals for the U.S. in track and field. And the U.S. basketball team, so it was still amateur at that time. This is before they didn't let professionals in. It was still an amateur team in 1988, and they beat the Soviets to win the gold. And it's said the worldwide K-pop phenomenon started in 1988 at the Olympics closing ceremony because there's a group called So Taiji and Boys. They performed their kind of K-pop stuff at the closing ceremony, so a lot of people say that maybe that's the start of K-pop, which is, I guess, pretty big now. I'm not too into it, but it's pretty huge. So there you have it, 1988. I want to mention a few other podcasts we have at the 80s and 90s Uncensored that I think you'd be interested in listening to if you're interested in 1988. So the first is the best and worst fashion of 1988. That's when we had a wheel spin and we had to explore, much to Milo's detriment, some of the best fashions that we thought were the best and a lot of the worst fashions of 1988. So check that out. And then if you're interested in more about sports from 1988, we have another podcast called The Fog Bowl. So 1988 divisional playoff game between the Philadelphia Eagles and Chicago Bears started out on a clear day, but as the second quarter came to a close, a dense fog rolled into Soldier Field and you couldn't see a thing. Some kind of weird, strange sci-fi horror type fog that just descended on this game, and it's a pretty interesting story actually. So with that, I'll say I'm out of here like Hans Gruber, who fell to his horrible death with a terrible surprised look on his face as he fell from Nakatomi Tower. See you in 1989.